The baby was crying again, but louder this time. And it wasn't just hunger. Her toes were turning red from cold. All three of them were huddled near the fire, and yet they shook. The log had barely caught. The frost had already crept halfway down the inside of the cabin walls, and through the heavy burlap nailed over the windows, she heard something that hadn't stopped for days. The wind, howling like death itself, had lost its way and was prowling through the high mountain woods, looking for shelter. But it wouldn't find this one. Not yet. Sarah Coleridge pressed her hand firm to the trapdoor beneath the rug, her palm trembling. Not from cold, but from decision. It had been 5 years since her husband died in that snowstorm, bringing down pine for the roof. 5 years since she buried him, half frozen, in a hole he'd dug before dying in it. She'd never once opened that shelter since, not even when the roof started leaking, not even when the last blizzard roared so hard it ripped the chicken coop into splinters. That shelter had been his idea, his secret, his obsession, and maybe his grave. But now her baby was turning blue. "Get your boots," she whispered to her oldest, who sat cross-legged with a blanket over her shoulders, mouth chapped and hair unwashed for days. "We're going down." The girl blinked. "Down where?" "Below us, into the shelter." The middle child, a boy of 7, stopped rocking beside the hearth and looked toward the rug. "The one Daddy built?" Sarah didn't answer. She just yanked the rug aside, revealing the brass ring bolted into the floorboards. Frost had formed on the ring itself. She had to pry it loose with a knife before she could even grip it with her fingers. When the trapdoor opened, warm air didn't rise. Cold did, but at least there was no wind down there, and that was already something. The lantern flickered as they descended the creaking wooden steps, one by one. Sarah went first, with the baby wrapped tight against her chest, breathing shallow but still breathing. Her son came next, holding the lantern. Then her daughter, who winced every time a board groaned under her weight. The bottom was deeper than she remembered, deeper than anyone in town would have believed a trapdoor could go. But her husband had been a miner before he was a builder, before he was a father, before the freeze of '69, when the whole north end of Clearstone got buried under 6 feet of snow, and half the church froze inside their pews. He'd started digging this place the winter after. Sarah's boots touched dirt. Not cold dirt, but oddly dry, packed and still. The air down here didn't feel like death. It felt like something kept, something saved. The lantern lit the room in a soft circle. It wasn't big, maybe 10 feet across, but it was tall, dug deep, shored up with old timbers, and lined with clay walls that looked like they'd been fired solid with heat. But it wasn't the walls that stopped her breath. It was the stove, not the one upstairs, not the iron-bellied thing she fed every morning until they ran out of chopped wood. This was different. This one was built into the ground. It didn't look like a stove. It looked like a mouth, wide, flat, with an iron grate over what looked like an old mining tunnel that stretched backward into the hill itself. Pipes stuck out from the sides, like branches from a dead tree, and some kind of strange metal cylinder sat beside it, closed tight. Her husband had called it his earth lung. "You said he never finished it," her daughter whispered. "I thought he didn't," Sarah murmured. "I thought he gave up when—" She couldn't say it, not with the baby whimpering against her chest. But he hadn't given up. He'd just hidden it, built the whole thing beneath them while she mourned and begged him to rebuild upstairs. He'd never explained it, not fully, only muttered about warm clay, passive channels, buried vents, and something he called heat holding, like he was building a lung that could breathe fire from one log for days. It sounded mad then, but now her children were dying. Sarah reached for the small pile of wood in the corner, 4 logs, all dry, all sealed in wax like they were treasure, and picked the smallest one. She opened the stove mouth and laid it in. Then she lit a match and waited. The flame didn't flare. It sank into the log like a tongue curling into the dark. For a moment, nothing. Then a faint hum, a soft pulsing in the metal behind the walls, a distant whoosh, like something had sucked the flame backward down the pipe and returned it, changed. She felt it before she saw it. The warmth, not burning heat, not a blast like fire, but something creeping along the floor, rising gentle, a warm exhale from beneath the earth. The baby stopped crying. By the second hour, the temperature had risen nearly 20 degrees. Sarah had peeled off her shawl. Her son dozed by the steps. Her daughter clutched the lantern and stared at the ceiling, lips moving silently in what might have been prayer or disbelief. "I don't think he was mad," she finally whispered. Sarah didn't answer. "I think he knew this would happen. No one knows what year the worst freeze is coming," Sarah said. "But he built this anyway. They all looked at the stove, still just one log inside, still warm. Outside, the wind was howling so hard it rattled the trapdoor above, but it couldn't reach them. Not here. The clay walls held, the earth lung sighed. The baby slept. For the first time in days, Sarah exhaled without pain in her chest, and for the first time in years, she didn't hate the sound of her husband's name echoing in her memory. But the night wasn't done, and neither was the storm, because when she went to check the food stores, she realized something terrible. The salt pork barrel was half full of water. The icebox had failed. The snow they'd packed into it last week had melted, not froze, melted. And then she remembered, this shelter had no door, only the trapdoor above. Only one log burned, and the food might not survive the heat. The salt pork sloshed as she shook the barrel. Not solid, not packed in hard chill like it had been when she sealed it a week ago. Now the fat floated in a brine that smelled wrong. The rind of meat at the top had bloomed a sick yellow and white, mold, and even in the low glow of the lantern she could see the grease separating from the liquid. Spoilage, not preservation. She hadn't thought it through. Of course she hadn't. She'd been desperate to get her children warm, not save the meat. But now that her heart was no longer thundering from fear, now that her baby's cheeks were pinking and her son was breathing steady, she had time to notice things, like how warm it truly was down here. The walls no longer felt like packed clay. They were holding heat like baked brick. The air wasn't stale, but fresh, like something was pulling in air from above or deeper below. That must have been the purpose of those strange iron vents, sloping into the distance, sealed with rivets, and covered in a thin breath of condensation. The earth lung was alive, but in breathing warmth into their bones, it was spoiling the last of their food. She didn't curse. She'd used all her curses in the first year of widowhood. She just pressed the lid shut on the pork barrel and turned to the sacks near the wall. Beans, dry but dampening now, the cloth growing soft. Flour, still dry inside its double-sewn canvas, but only just. Salt, safe, for now. Sugar, gone, hardened into a rock. She'd known it was too late to keep when she brought it down. The root vegetables were the worst. Her husband's old bins, dug into the back wall, had kept turnips, carrots, and potatoes for months in the past. Now, in this new warmth, they were already turning. The smell of wet soil and rot lifted like breath from a dying animal. Not all of them, not yet, but a few had split open from the moisture, their starchy flesh curling in on itself like a boiled thing. Sarah knelt and picked through them. Her hands trembled, not from the cold now, but from the realization that they might have to choose warmth or food, life now or life later. She held up one potato, still firm, no mold. She could almost hear her husband's voice. Use the worst first. Leave the good till you've got a plan. A plan. She didn't even know how to work the stove properly. That one log, it had been burning, or perhaps smoldering, for nearly 4 hours. No crackle, no blaze, just the same soft breath of heat pouring out of the vented grate and rising, without smoke, without firelight, into the room. Whatever he had built, it wasn't just a stove, it was something else. You think he meant for us to live down here forever? Her son asked. He was squatting beside the pipe now, feeling the heat rise through his palms. No, she said quietly, brushing flour dust from her apron. He meant for us to survive just long enough. Long enough for what? For spring, or rescue, or the storm to pass. Whichever came first. She didn't want to say what they all knew. Sometimes none of those things came. Her daughter was reading again, not from a Bible, but from the old journal they'd found wedged behind one of the support beams. Sarah hadn't seen it in years, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Her husband's, the same uneven scrawl she'd memorized in their courting days when he wrote letters from logging camps, where he'd carved whole paragraphs into birch bark just to tell her about the moonlight. Now those same letters mapped diagrams of venting systems, heat capture tricks, and strange ideas about buried thermal masses and breathable clay. Listen to this, her daughter whispered. The stove must not burn like fire. Fire wastes. It must breathe like a chest. Take in cold, push out warmth. It will feed the clay, and the clay will hold it. If it works, one log should last the better part of a day, maybe more. Her eyes scanned further down. She won't believe me. She thinks I'm trying to bury myself. Maybe I am, but if I'm right, this place won't need tending. It'll breathe on its own. Even if I don't. She looked up, eyes wet. He was talking about you? Sarah turned away. He knew he wouldn't be here to explain it. The room fell quiet. Even the stove made no sound now, just a presence. A low, ambient hum, like the earth itself was keeping them company. By dusk, which they measured only by how long the lantern had been burning, Sarah made her decision. They would ration the spoiled pork, eat the hard sugar scrapings, and boil every turnip that hadn't yet burst. The root bin would be rotated, airing each batch, moving the soft ones forward and the firm ones to the back. They'd lower the temperature, if she could figure out how, maybe by partially blocking the intake vents with clay. They had enough for 4 days if they didn't panic, 5 if they stretched the beans with flour and boiled water. But what they didn't have was knowledge of what lay above. The storm could have passed, or it could have buried the cabin entirely. Sarah climbed the stairs and pressed her ear to the trapdoor. Nothing but silence, not even the whistle of wind. That scared her more than the howling. She twisted the latch and cracked the door. A gust of powdered snow fell in like smoke. She shut it fast, not because of the snow, but because of what she saw. White, just white. The cabin above was gone, or rather hidden, buried under a drift that had swallowed the chimney, the windows, and the roofline. She couldn't even see the rafters anymore, just pale, crushing weight. If they'd stayed upstairs, they'd have frozen, or worse. She sealed the door and locked it tight. When she turned, her children were watching. "We're not going up again," she said. They nodded. No questions. They understood. That night the log still burned. It had shrunk, yes, smaller, more coal-like, but it hadn't died, and the heat hadn't faded. In fact, the floor was warm enough now that the baby slept with bare hands. Sarah feared it. If it got too warm, the air would stagnate. If it stagnated, mold would spread. They'd choke. So she tried something desperate. She removed one of the stove's side plates, a square iron cap with her husband's initials carved into it. It popped loose with a clang. Behind it, a narrow duct sloped downward, full of dark, dry clay. She didn't know what it did. She didn't know if opening it would ruin everything, but she trusted him. And when she opened it, the room cooled, not drastically, but enough. The air circulated. She could feel it, a faint backdraft, like a lung exhaling downward, not upward. It meant the system wasn't just pumping heat, it was breathing, pulling stale air out and fresh air in. Somehow, somewhere, the earth was working with them now. On the 3rd day, the log was still not done. Sarah turned it with a stick and found the heart of it still glowing. The heat had weakened, yes, but the room was still temperate, and she realized maybe the log wasn't burning, but baking, feeding into the clay vents, re-radiating slowly. The earth lung was more than a name. It was a design, a breathing cycle, exhale and inhale, a closed loop of warmth and draft, sealed under feet of soil and clay, safe from wind, safe from cold, safe from death. They had found their rhythm now, meals at intervals, journaling to pass time, storytelling, laughter even, and always listening to the hum of the system, the soft pulse of something below them alive and moving. But then, on the 4th day, something changed. The hum stopped, just once, only for a moment, but it stopped. Sarah heard it, so did her daughter. They froze, waiting. It came back, but not as steady, not as smooth. And then, the heat began to drop, not fast, but real. She rushed to the stove. The log was down to a dark curl, barely embered. She reached for another from the stash, only 2 left, and slid it in. The stove sighed. The hum returned. But now they knew it would not last forever, and if they wanted to survive, someone would have to go up. The 2nd log burned differently. Sarah noticed it within the hour. It wasn't just a change in smell or light. It was the behavior of the room itself. The hum returned, yes, and the air began to warm again. But it wasn't as even, as balanced as before. Instead of that low, breathing thrum she'd grown used to, the soft, stable exhale of warmth, there was now a faint sputter in it, a kind of irregular rhythm, like the lungs of the earth were starting to struggle. Her daughter noticed too. She had taken to sleeping with her hand pressed against one of the clay-lined pipes. "It's not steady," she whispered that night. "It's like a heartbeat skipping." Sarah didn't say anything. She couldn't. Her son had begun coughing, not violently, but enough to scare her, and the baby's lips, while still pink, seemed drier than they had before. They were running out of time. The snow hadn't melted. That was the part that hit hardest when Sarah cracked the trapdoor open the next morning. After spending hours convincing herself maybe the drift would have shrunk, maybe the sun had returned, maybe there was blue sky again above the storm. No, the snow was still there, but now it had hardened. It wasn't soft powder anymore. It was ice, pressed tight against the trapdoor, glistening under the faint light of the lantern. She pressed her shoulder against it and felt nothing move, not even a shift. The entire upper cabin was locked inside a shell, a frozen tomb. They were trapped, not just snowed in, but entombed, unless they dug. Sarah didn't make the decision lightly, but no one else could make it at all. Her son was feverish now, not dangerously so, not yet, but warm enough that she feared what a drop in temperature would mean. Her daughter had been strong, but her hands were blistering from proximity to the pipes. She'd been trying to regulate the heat herself, blocking one vent with old rags, opening others. But the soot and warmth had begun to leave burns beneath her fingernails. The baby was silent, too silent. There was only one option. Sarah would go up. She didn't tell the children at first. She waited until night, when the stove had settled into that low whisper again, when the second log was halfway gone but still giving off heat. She watched their faces in the faint glow, sick and worn, yes, but not terrified, not yet, and she wanted to keep it that way. The journal helped. Every night her daughter read from it, some pages practical, others personal. "If this works," she read aloud once, "maybe she'll understand why I buried it. Maybe she'll forgive me for digging a home she couldn't see, for building shelter that looked like a grave. But if this place keeps her warm, then maybe it was a kind of love." Sarah had to turn away, because now that grave was a refuge, and it was up to her to see if the world above still existed. She woke before first light. Not that light existed down here, not really, and dressed in layers. Her husband's old coat, her boots, cracked but patched, mittens lined with rabbit fur, torn at the seams. Around her neck she tied the baby's swaddling blanket, just in case the cold was worse than she imagined. Her daughter sat up when she unlatched the trap door. "Where are you going?" the girl whispered. "Just to see." "Don't leave." "I won't. You're not strong enough." Sarah turned. "I buried your father on the coldest day of the year, dug a hole with my bare hands, because the shovel was frozen solid. I'll manage." And she did, barely. The snow above the trapdoor had hardened to a crust, like rock. She pushed against it, chipping with a kitchen knife first, then the heel of her boot. Every inch was agony, but she worked for hours, using the lantern light to guide her movements, pushing upward inch by inch until the snow began to loosen. Eventually, her fingers met air, dry, dead air, but air nonetheless. She reached up and pulled. The roof timbers groaned, then broke. She coughed as cold blasted into her face, slicing across her cheeks like a knife. But she could see it now. Dim sky, grey and thick, churning above the wreck of her cabin. What had once been walls were now twisted boards beneath a collapsed ceiling of white. The entire upper room had been crushed. Nothing remained but splinters and snow, and one broken window frame staring blindly into the forest. She hauled herself up. The snow was higher than she expected. The drift had covered half the hill. Trees bent under the weight of frost, bark cracking, branches hanging like broken limbs. The air didn't just feel cold, it felt dead, still. Even the birds had gone. She turned, looking down the slope toward what should have been the old logging road. Nothing, just white. But in the distance, far beyond the creek bed, at the base of the next hill, she saw it. Smoke, thin, faint, rising from the treetops like a breath. Someone was alive. It took her nearly an hour to get back into the shelter. Her hands bled from the climb. Her knees were numb. But when she dropped down through the trapdoor, the warmth greeted her like an old friend. She collapsed against the floor and lay there, weeping. The children didn't cheer. They didn't ask questions. They just hugged her. She told them about the smoke, that someone had made it, that maybe they could signal them. But her voice cracked when she said it, because even if help came, they had one log left, and only the failing hum of the stove to carry them. That night Sarah slept with her back against the stove. It wasn't wise, but she wanted to feel it, the breathing, the pulse, the slow warmth of something keeping them alive when the rest of the world had died. She dreamed of him, not in the vague way that grief dreams come, his voice, his back turned, his face always in shadow. No, she dreamed of his hands. They were gloved, calloused, digging in the dirt, working clay, mixing straw into mud, fitting pipes into holes, sealing metal plates, building, breathing. He turned and looked at her, and she remembered the last thing he ever said before he went into the storm. "I can't stop the cold, but I can teach the earth to remember the heat." She woke with that in her ears, and with her daughter shaking her shoulder. "The baby," she whispered. "What?" "She's not moving." Sarah's scream nearly broke the silence. But the baby wasn't dead, just chilled. The temperature had dropped again. The second log was nearly gone. The stove was cooling. They had one log left, and rescue was not coming yet. Sarah stood in front of the grate, cradling the infant, her face blank with the weight of too many thoughts. She could burn the last log now and get one more day, maybe two. But if she timed it wrong, if help came on the third, then they'd die warm, not waiting. Or, she looked at the journal. One entry near the end stood out. "Heat is not fire. Fire is loss. Heat is memory. If I built it right, the clay remembers warmth, like lungs remember breath. If she stokes it right, maybe she won't need the last log at all." Sarah closed her eyes. She wasn't sure if it was madness, but she would try. She'd save the last log, and instead she'd give the stove something else, something the earth might remember. She turned toward the back wall, where the bin of old lumber sat, broken furniture, chair legs, bent tools, and one small wooden cradle. She lifted the cradle and slid it into the fire. The cradle caught slowly. It was old, oak heavy, carved by her husband's hand, and worn smooth by 3 sets of infant fingers over the years. Its curves still bore the scratches of restless nights, and Sarah could almost see the ghosts of her children swaddled in it. First Lila, then the boy, then her baby girl, now curled in her arms, too still. When she fed it into the stove, she didn't hesitate. She didn't let herself. She pushed it in sideways, so the wood would catch slower, its bulk pressing against the stove mouth's iron edges like a final offering. The flames licked it tenderly at first, then more hungrily. A curl of smoke slipped through the grating before the vent kicked in and drew it downward, as if the stove had exhaled and accepted the gift. The warmth that followed wasn't instant, but it was real. It came not as a wave, but a deepening of the air around them, an almost imperceptible thickening of temperature, like the earth had remembered what she wanted it to forget. Her husband was right. The stove didn't burn like fire. It remembered like a wound. She sat there watching, her back pressed against the clay wall, the baby wrapped tight against her breast. Lila spooned a portion of boiled turnips into the tin bowl, slowly, methodically. Her son lay curled beside the vent, cheeks flushed again, not from fever now, but from the soft return of heat. They had cheated death another day, but the cost was rising. The cradle was gone. The bin of broken wood, once ignored, once useless, was now a lifeline. And it wasn't just furniture anymore. It was memory. It was sacrifice. Sarah stood up, weak in the knees, and began pulling out more. A chair leg, a splintered drawer from the old cabinet, the carved edge of what once had been her wedding chest. Everything that once had held meaning was now flammable. That's what survival demanded. Not the box, Lila said, watching. Sarah paused, hand on the lid. It was Papa's. So was the cradle. Lila didn't speak. She just turned back to the journal, her eyes glassy but unreadable. The box was cedar, heavy, lined with brass. It burned better than she expected. On the 5th day, the snow finally cracked. It was mid-morning, or so they guessed, based on the dimming and return of lantern light over the long hours, when Sarah heard it. A thump above, then a sliding noise, like a branch falling. She climbed up quickly, still stiff from cold but steadier now, and pushed the trapdoor open an inch. This time, the snow moved. A crack had formed across the drift, a pressure break where the weight had become too much and the freeze had begun to thaw just slightly. It was a small thing, barely noticeable to most, but Sarah knew the mountain. She'd lived here too long. The crust was weakening, the deep freeze was ending, and that meant one thing. They had to act before it refroze. She slid the trapdoor fully open and climbed into what remained of the cabin, a jagged shell now, with half its wallboards leaning like drunkards, and its chimney snapped clean in two. The wind had died, but the cold was still knife-sharp. In the distance, the smoke was still visible. More now, not one plume, but 2. That meant people, or at least someone with fire. She had to reach them, but not alone. She gathered everything that could burn, not just furniture now, but anything that held dry fiber. A stack of papers, old linens, the fraying edge of the doormat, the pages of a long rotted almanac. She broke apart the baby's old playpen, unscrewed the wooden pegs from the tool rack, even split the broom handle, and threw it into the shelter below. Every piece counted. She made her way back down, cheeks raw and red. Lila was waiting, sitting close to her brother, holding the baby. The second stovepipe, one of the back vents, had begun to drip, not with water but with condensation. It meant the earth beyond the shelter wall was warming. The frost line was receding. They didn't have much time. "We're going to have to leave," Sarah said. Lila nodded slowly. "But we can't all go." The words hung like a blade. "I'll go," Lila said. "You won't. You're the only one who can keep them alive." Sarah shook her head. "And you're the only one with the legs to climb that drift." They stared at each other across the stove, across the warmth, across the bond that had been formed not just by blood, but by shared silence in the dark. Then Lila stood. "I'll take the signal mirror. If I can get above the tree line, I'll flash toward the smoke." Sarah's mouth went dry. "You'll freeze." "No," Lila said, her voice quiet. "I won't, because you're going to burn the last log after I leave. That's how we all survive." Sarah gripped the edge of the table. "If we burn it now, it'll buy us time. Enough for someone to see me, enough for them to come. It might not be enough. It might be all we've got." They dressed her in every scrap of warmth they could find. Mittens patched with baby clothes, socks layered 4 deep, a scarf wrapped tight enough to mute breath. Her boots were too thin, but Sarah stuffed them with wool from an unraveling pillow. On her back, Lila carried the mirror, a gift from Sarah's husband years ago, kept always in the wedding chest, now polished clean. "I'll go up and climb the ridge," she said, "the one with the old firewatch tree. If I can get high enough, I can flash toward the smoke." Sarah nodded, lips tight. "You'll stay here, keep the stove going. If they come, they'll follow the reflection or the trail. And if they don't, Lila looked down. They will. She climbed the ladder without hesitation. When the trapdoor closed behind her, the silence felt unbearable. Sarah turned to the stove and opened the grate. The last log waited. She laid it inside like a prayer and lit it. The warmth came fast this time, as if the earth had grown used to the fire, as if it was no longer resisting, no longer questioning. The clay walls seemed to breathe deeper. The pipes exhaled fuller. The hum that followed was the strongest yet, like a choir rising from the stone. Sarah wrapped the children tighter and moved them closer to the vent. The baby was crying again, not weakly this time, but fully, loud, alive. The food was nearly gone, but she forced the last bit of beans into the pot and heated them slow, careful not to waste flame. Her son was still coughing, but his breath had steadied. Then the waiting began. Hours passed, then more. No sound from above, no knock, no shovel against snow, no shout, only the low breathing of the stove and the high-pitched whistle of wind between the cracks of the trapdoor. Sarah kept her eyes on the ladder, listening, praying. Her hands stayed pressed to the baby's back, counting each tiny breath. Then, as her eyes were closing from exhaustion, a sound, not from above, from beyond the wall, a shk, then a thump, then another. She rushed to the ladder and threw the trapdoor wide. Snow blinded her for a second. Then movement, voices, people. A team of 2 men, both wrapped in snow gear, both wide-eyed, peered down through a gap in the drift they'd carved. "Mom!" one shouted. "We saw the flashes. A girl on the ridge told us her family was buried below." Sarah's knees buckled. "She made it," she whispered. The man nodded. "She's waiting at the base. Says you've got a stove that runs off miracles." Sarah looked behind her, at the children huddled by the glowing pipe, at the last embers of the final log curling inside the earth lung, at the walls her husband built and the warmth they'd held. "No," she whispered, "not miracles, just memory." The man extended a hand. She took it and stepped into the light. They came at dusk. Sarah saw them first, 3 figures trudging through the melting crust of snow, heads bowed, tools slung over their backs. She stood outside the ruined cabin, knees deep in slush, shawl pulled around her ears. The cold still cut, but it no longer carried the promise of death. The wind had softened. The sky was a dull silver instead of black. Lila ran to her, boots cracking through layers of thawing ice, her face red from cold and smiling despite it. "I saw them," she gasped. "They saw me." Behind her, the rescuers carried wool blankets, lanterns, dried goods. One was a ranger from the South Trail, another a trapper who'd taken shelter in the coal caverns. The third, a stranger from the valley, had seen the mirror flashes for hours and followed them up the slope. They found the trapdoor without instructions. Sarah had left it open. They descended into the earth lung and stood in stunned silence, lanterns held high. The stove still exhaled its final breath. The baby slept, cheeks pink. The boy stirred and looked up. "Are you angels?" No one spoke. The ranger finally knelt. "No, son, just folks who still remember what people are worth." By morning they were carried out on sleds, wrapped in fur and wool. Lila led the way, walking ahead with the mirror tucked under her arm like a badge. The rescuers followed, pulling the children, then Sarah last, limping but alive. She looked back once before descending the ridge. The roof was gone, the walls too, but the trapdoor remained, barely visible under snow that would melt by week's end. Somewhere beneath that hill, the earth still held their warmth, and her husband's memory burned on, not in fire, but in breath, in silence, and in survival.